72 years old. That's when most people expect stillness, rest, maybe a garden and grandchildren on Sundays. Margaret Hale got divorce papers instead. 47 years of marriage, and Daniel Hale carved it all up like a Sunday roast. The house? His. The car? His. The bank accounts? His. He pushed her out the door with 2 suitcases and never looked back, convinced he'd taken everything worth taking. But Daniel missed something. One small piece of land tied to Margaret's blood, to her mother, to a history he never bothered to understand. That overlooked detail would eventually make everything he fought for meaningless. If this is the kind of story that speaks to you, stay with me through the end, and subscribe so you don't miss what comes next. October crept down the quiet street like a long, tired breath. Dry leaves scraped across the pavement, gathering at the front steps of the old house. Margaret stood in the doorway, fingers pinching the edges of her thin cardigan. Not from the cold outside. She'd grown used to a deeper cold, the kind that settles in your chest and stays. A hollowness spreading outward. Something had ended a long time ago. Her mind just hadn't caught up yet. Behind her, the door swung open and shut. Movers flowed through the house like water through a cracked vessel, carrying out lamps, chairs, boxes of dishes, loading them onto the truck without a second glance, as if none of it had ever mattered to anyone. Quick hands, blank faces. These were men who dismantled other people's lives for a living. Looking back wasn't part of the job. At the end of the driveway, Daniel Hale leaned against his polished sedan. The finish caught the weak afternoon light, gleaming against the tired neighborhood like something that didn't belong. He checked his watch, adjusted a cuff. He looked like a man waiting for a restaurant table, not a man closing the door on 47 years. __quote _0 _ one of the movers said, wiping his palms on his pants. Daniel gave a short nod and pulled a folder from under his arm. That folder. Margaret had watched it grow for 3 months. Documents, signatures, stamps and seals. Page after careful page, it had quietly erased the life she once thought belonged to her. Margaret stepped down one stair. Her voice came out softer than she meant, almost swallowed by the breeze. He exhaled. Not from exhaustion, not from sorrow. Pure impatience. He cut her off, flat, emotionless. Her eyes drifted past his shoulder. Through the open door. A pale rectangle on the wall where their wedding photo had hung for decades. The porch railing he'd built with his own hands the summer their son was born. It all rushed in at once. Laughter, birthday candles, whispered conversations at midnight. The quiet grace of early mornings with coffee and silence. The memories hit so hard she swayed on her feet. She started. But Daniel had already turned his back. Collect your things and go. He waved toward the 2 suitcases sitting at the curb. So small. Almost impossible to believe a whole life could be packed down into so little. My things? Margaret's throat tightened around the words. Quote 7, he said. His eyes never once found hers. Quote 8. Margaret held his gaze a moment longer, searching, looking for something, any flicker of doubt, any shadow of the man who'd stood beside her for nearly half a century. She found nothing, only a terrible calm. The way someone looks at a person they've already forgotten. __, quote _9 __, she whispered. Daniel said nothing. He adjusted his cuff again, slowly, deliberately, as though that small motion mattered more than she did. Quote 10, he said at last. Quote 11. That word, facilities, hit harder than anything else that had left his mouth. Margaret stood still. Her hands shook. She didn't hide them, didn't clench them into fists. She just let them hang there, as if their trembling no longer concerned her. Quote 12. Quote 13. His voice didn't waver, didn't soften. Wind swept through without warning, dragging brittle leaves across the pavement, circling the two suitcases at her feet. Silence pressed down, heavy, suffocating. Then Daniel reached into his jacket and pulled out an envelope. He held it toward her. Quote 15, quote, he said. Quote 16, quote. Margaret stared at his hand for a long time before she took it. Her fingers were numb against the paper. Underscore underscore, quote underscore, 17 underscore underscore. He hesitated, barely, a fraction of a second. Most people would miss. Underscore underscore, quote underscore, 18 underscore underscore. He turned, opened the car door. The engine came alive, quiet, smooth, expensive. Margaret didn't move. Some part of her still waited for a different word, a different ending. Nothing came. Take care of yourself, Margaret, he said, like closing a transaction. The door shut, the car pulled away. He never looked back. The road emptied. The sound of the engine thinned into nothing. What remained was silence, thick, physical, pressing against her skin. Margaret stood there, staring at the vacant stretch of asphalt, as though willpower alone could undo what had just happened. Nothing undid itself. She lowered herself onto the curb. Rough concrete bit through the thin fabric of her clothes. She looked down at the cracks in the pavement, trying to find something solid, something real. Her hand drifted into her handbag, not searching for documents or legal papers, searching for something that still belonged to her. Her fingers found it, small, cool, familiar. She pulled it free, a brass key, old and worn smooth by decades of touch. Margaret turned it over in her palm, and something stirred. Not a clear memory, not yet. More like a scent. Pine resin. The sound of wind pushing through branches. A voice calling from a porch. A place. Hidden. Untouched. A place no one had ever asked about because no one had ever known it mattered. Her fingers closed around the key, tight. And for the first time since that car disappeared down the road, Margaret raised her head. Not toward the highway stretching ahead, toward somewhere else entirely. The next morning, she sat in the back of an intercity bus, both suitcases wedged upright against her knees, handbag balanced on her lap. Through the glass, the city fell away, pale gray smears, low rooftops, thin ribbons of mist swallowing everything she was leaving behind. The driver kept quiet. So did the other passengers. Every person on that bus carried their own reason for going, their own thing they were running from. None of them spared a glance at the older woman sitting perfectly still, hands folded, her thumb tracing the shape of a key hidden inside her coat pocket. 2 buses in the short walk from the last stop, and the pavement ended. Ahead stretched a narrow dirt path, crowded on both sides by dense trees, wild grass spilling across the edges. No one had come this way in a long time. Margaret gripped her suitcase handle and kept moving. The wheels caught on loose stones, on roots that had buckled up through the earth. She had to stop more than once, to shift her grip on the handle, to pull air into her lungs, to look back down the road behind her. A road that seemed to stretch longer with every step she took. The air out here carried a different weight entirely. Damp earth, pine resin, rotting leaves, and that particular dry cold that belongs only to deep forest in late autumn. At some point, the noise of traffic had disappeared. In its place, branches whispering against each other high overhead and the soft crush of her own feet on dead leaves. More than once, Margaret questioned whether she'd chosen the right path. 40 years can reshape a landscape beyond recognition. And memory has a habit of painting everything in gentler colors, warmer light. But when she reached the third bend in the clearing, where the trees pulled apart like curtains, she saw it. The cabin, smaller than she remembered, leaning slightly to the left, but standing. The wooden roof had gone dark from years of rain and sun. One corner of the porch drooped badly. The old railing wore a thin coat of dust and moss. Yet the structure held. It stood there with a stillness and clarity that made it seem as though it had never been abandoned at all. Margaret stopped a few paces from the porch. She did not go closer. Not yet. She just looked, as if she needed to prove to herself that this was real, not something conjured by exhaustion and despair. The sheer curtain still hung in the left window. The wooden chair where her mother used to sit on slow afternoons still leaned against the wall, one leg slightly off angle. A cracked ceramic pot rested beneath the porch eaves, empty for years, clearly. She eased her suitcase onto the first step. The old wood groaned softly beneath the weight. Second step. Third. The original door stood before her, fitted with a brass lock gone dark with tarnish. Margaret drew the key from her coat pocket, studied it for a breath, slid it into the lock. At first, it refused to turn. She pressed gently, working it deeper into the mechanism. A faint, dry click. The bolt gave. The door swung inward with a long, deep creak. Inside was darker than she expected. Not pitch black, but dim. Light seeped through dusty glass in pale, muted sheets. The air hung cool and thick, heavy with the smell of old wood. Margaret set her bags just inside the door, stood still, let her eyes adjust. Then she crossed the threshold. Everything was almost exactly where it had always been. The wooden table in the center of the room, draped in white cloth gone yellow with time. The small group of chairs gathered near the hearth. The low bookshelf flat against the wall, still holding empty glass jars and a few cloth-bound books. The grey stone fireplace with its neat stack of firewood beside it, as though someone had meant to light a fire one particular evening and never came back to do it. Margaret moved through the main room slowly. Her fingertips grazed the tabletop, the chair backs, the rough lip of the fireplace stone. In the small kitchen beyond, the hanging pot rack, the porcelain sink, the wooden cabinet with its slightly warped door. She opened every drawer. Porcelain plates, tablecloths folded with care, a box of matches softened by damp, a bottle of oil tucked into the lowest shelf. There was nothing here that Daniel would have called valuable. No precious metals, no financial documents, no possessions meant to impress. Only things kept with purpose by someone who believed objects existed to serve a life, not to be displayed for strangers. At the end of the narrow hallway lay the small bedroom. The bedspread still in place. Its colors faded but clean beneath a thin skin of dust. A patchwork quilt folded neatly at the foot of the bed. On the wall, the embroidered wildflower frame Rose Bennett had stitched during her last winter, still hanging. And in the corner of the room, beside the base of the wardrobe, stood the wooden trunk. Margaret lowered herself carefully, pressing her palm against the trunk's lid. The hinges resisted, stiff, reluctant, but gave way. Inside, she found nothing she'd expected. No old clothes, no scattered letters. Notebooks, dozens of them, stacked in neat rows, their covers wrapped in muted cloth. Brown, blue, gray. Each spine carried her mother's handwriting. Summer gardening, preserving herbs, miscellaneous kitchen notes. Margaret lifted the first one, sat on the bed's edge, and opened to the first page. The script was steady, clear, slanting gently rightward. Underscore underscore, quote underscore, 20 underscore underscore. She turned several more pages. How to dehydrate apples. How to keep mint leaves fragrant through winter. When to plant beans, precisely as the soil warmed enough to receive them. Between the instructions, small notes about weather, about the color of the sky, and the quiet reminder that nothing of real value should ever be thrown away. Margaret set the notebook on her lap, looked toward the open window, then rose and walked back into the main room. She lit the fire as twilight began settling into the sky. Boiled water in the old kettle. Found clean blankets in the upper cupboard. opened the smaller suitcase for a change of clothes and a few necessities. When the fire held steady, she pulled a chair close to the hearth, placed the notebook on the table beside her, and took in the room one last time. Outside, the wind had changed direction, threading through the trees, tapping softly against the wooden roof. The first morning at the cabin arrived with faint sounds of wood contracting in the cold. Pale light crept past the curtain's edge. Margaret woke in the narrow bed, needing a moment to place herself. The low ceiling, dark planks, the smell of wood smoke still hanging in everything. Beyond the walls, the forest stood motionless beneath a thin skin of mist. She sat up, pulled on her cardigan, stepped into worn shoes, walked into the main room. The fireplace embers still glowed faintly under ash. She stirred them with the iron poker, added small logs, waited for flame, set the kettle on the stove. In daylight, the cabin looked brighter. The wear showed more plainly, but so did something else. This place could still be useful. It just needed someone willing to do the work. Margaret opened every window, wedged the front door open with a small wooden block, and began cleaning. She pulled dust covers from the table and chairs, carried them outside, shook them hard. Found a broom and swept every corner of the place, dry leaves and cobwebs from the narrow hallway, dirt from beneath the furniture. When she stayed bent too long, her back began to ache. When she straightened too fast, her knees locked. She didn't rush, she simply didn't stop. By midday, the floorboards showed lighter wood beneath where the dust had been. Sunlight poured through the front window, throwing a long, bright rectangle across the table. She scrubbed the kitchen sink, rearranged the dishes, wiped down every glass jar one by one. In the tall cabinet beside the fireplace, she found a small cloth bag of dried beans, too old to plant but still whole. Beneath it, several white candles, a coil of thin rope, a bottle of oil nearly full. That afternoon, she carried one of Rose Bennett's notebooks outside and sat on the porch steps to read. A light breeze moved through the small yard. The first entries were simple. Sweep the chimney before autumn ends. Store dry firewood under the porch roof. But as she turned deeper into the pages, something became clear. These notebooks had been written with extraordinary care. They held more than recipes or household tips. They contained an entire way of seeing the world, set down in handwriting so clear and deliberate, it felt like listening to someone speak. __, quote _ 21 __. The next page laid out a method for soaking apples with cinnamon. After that, instructions for drying rosemary leaves without losing their scent. One section described how to set up a small roadside stand at the start of spring, when people passing through would begin looking for homemade food instead of whatever the town shops stocked in plastic. Margaret's eyes stayed on that passage longer than the rest. That evening, she made a simple dinner from what remained in her suitcase and a few items bought at a rest stop the day before. Then she sat by the fireplace and kept reading, one notebook to the next. An entire volume devoted to sourdough bread, plum jam, elderberry syrup. Another catalogued the leaves of the surrounding forest. Which ones eased the cough? Which ones drove off insects? Which ones were dangerous unless dried long and thoroughly in open sun? Folded inside the back cover of a gray notebook, her mother had tucked a piece of paper. Names of people who once lived nearby. What they typically bought and in which season. The next 3 days settled into a rhythm that repeated itself without variation. Mornings, she lit the fire, cleaned, made small repairs. Midday, she read the notebooks, memorized what she could, reorganized the kitchen. Afternoons, she walked the land around the cabin. She found the ghost of a vegetable garden, swallowed by grass. A few wild sage bushes still clinging to life beside a rotting fence. A low apple tree, trunk twisted and scarred, but alive. Strong even. Under a heap of leaves in the small shed along the side wall, Margaret pulled out a hoe, a shovel, a rake. Rust spotted the metal like age spots on old skin. She wiped each one with a damp cloth and stood them back against the wall. As winter pressed harder, the cabin stopped looking abandoned. A pitcher of clean water sat on the windowsill. On the kitchen table, bread she had baked herself following Rose Bennett's recipe. The first loaf came out heavy, dense, but it was bread, and she had made it with her own hands. 3 jars stood in a neat row on the shelf near the fireplace, washed, dried, turned upside down. Margaret began writing in a new notebook she had found at the bottom of the trunk, filling the blank pages in its second half. The date, the weather, what she had done that day, what she needed to buy when she next made it into town. By the end of the second month, she walked into town carrying a paper bag of small pastries and a jar of apple cinnamon jam made step by step from the notebook's instructions. Nobody there knew her face. The man who ran the general store watched her a bit too long when she asked for sugar pectin, a fresh set of jar lids, and a packet of cheap seeds. But the woman behind the counter at the kitchen supply shop, she tasted a spoonful of the jam, looked up. Asked if there was more, Margaret said she was only experimenting. The woman smiled and told her next time she came through, she should bring a bigger batch. 1 week later, Margaret set an old wooden crate near the edge of the dirt road, about 20 paces from the cabin. 3 jars of jam, 2 small loaves of bread, a bundle of sage tied with string. A sign written by hand in black ink. Homemade goods. Place money in the tin box. She didn't stand beside it. She sat on the porch with a notebook in her hand, glancing across the yard now and then. The first car eased to a stop just before noon. A man in a thick coat stepped out, lifted a jar of jam, turned it in his hands. He looked toward the cabin, then he folded bills into the tin box and drove away. By midday, a couple pulled over. They bought bread and a bundle of herbs. They wanted to know who made these things. Margaret answered from the porch. She did. The woman smiled, said they'd come back if their route brought them this way on the right day. When the light started fading, Margaret carried the tin box inside. A few folded bills, some coins, not much. She set the box on the table, opened the new notebook, uncapped her pen, and made the first entry under a heading she'd written herself. Underscore underscore, quote underscore, 23 underscore underscore. One by one, she recorded the items sold beside their amounts. Then she totaled them slowly, the pen tip tracing each number. The sum was small, but it was enough to drive back to town for sugar, flour, jar lids, a handful of cheap seed packets. After that day, the wooden crate by the road stopped being an experiment. She scrubbed the table surface clean, worked the grime from its worn edges, wedged 2 flat stones beneath the legs so it stood level on the ground. On the handwritten sign, she added 1 careful line beneath the words, bread on Tuesdays and Fridays. In the weeks after, more people came. Some bought a single jar of preserves and left. Others lingered, asked for directions to town, wanted to know if the dried bundle was rosemary or sage. Asked whether she'd bake apple bread next week, Margaret answered briefly. She offered little about herself. She asked less about them. But certain faces began repeating. A man in a battered pickup stopped most Friday mornings for 2 loaves. A nurse from a clinic 10 miles out came for plum jam and herbal infusions. An older couple from a nearby community brought small containers of seedlings, said the soil around the cabin got enough sun for beans and mint. Margaret took them, carried them behind the cabin, opened her mother's journal again. Then she pressed short wooden markers into the dirt where each plant would go. Winter loosened its grip slowly, giving way to the damp cool of early spring. Green appeared around the cabin, first tangled with weeds, then, row by row, separating itself as she turned the soil. Mustard greens, scallions, climbing beans, thyme, marigolds to keep the insects back, a line of mint along the fence. On the front porch, bundles of herbs hung upside down to dry, stems pointing at the ceiling. Below them stood the wooden table, draped now in a fresh cloth. The jars sat in straighter rows. The handwritten labels were cleaner than before. Each week, the selection grew by 1 or 2 items. The cabin itself seemed to match this rhythm. The leaning porch rail got propped first with a piece of lumber salvaged from the shed. Then the truck driver came by one afternoon and fixed it properly. The kitchen window frame was sealed where drafts had crept through. A new shelf went up near the hearth to hold finished jars. On the wall across from the front door, Margaret hung a small slate with the week's tasks. 3 more batches of strawberry preserves. Dry apples. Mend the back curtain. Check the porch roof before the heavy rain they were expecting. Everything began settling into order. At first light, she would start the fire, shape the dough, and wait for the yeast to rise. By midday, she was in the garden, pulling dead leaves, clearing weeds, watching new shoots press through the soil. Afternoons belonged to the kitchen. Jam bubbling on the stove, jars scrubbed clean, lids sealed tight, dates written on every label in her own steady hand. Evenings drew her back to the ancestral journals, where she'd test an unfamiliar recipe or copy passages into her current notebook with deliberate care. The pages grew fat with fresh entries. No longer Rose Bennett's wisdom alone. Margaret Hale's own thoughts now lived between those lines. Once, the nurse asked how long she'd been living there. "Less than a year," Margaret told her. The woman looked around. The garden, the small display of goods for sale, the porch roof patched with obvious intention, and said the place looked like someone had been caring for it far longer. Margaret smoothed the cloth along the table's edge, said only that there was still plenty left to do. Word about the little house on the dirt road spread the way useful knowledge always does in tight communities. No fanfare, no announcement. Just one person telling another that a certain place sold apple bread worth driving for. That the preserves weren't cloyingly sweet. That you could buy bundles of dried herbs there to steep for a raw throat. That the older woman living alone near the woods understood, almost instinctively, which plants would take root in stubborn soil. A handful of people started choosing the longer route just to stop by. A restaurant owner asked whether she could manage 20 jars of blueberry preserves by next month. A young woman building a weekend produce stand wanted to know if Margaret would bring her goods into town. Margaret didn't say yes to everything. She measured what her hands could hold, counted the empty jars, walked the garden plots behind the house, calculated what she could take on without breaking the fragile balance of a life she'd only just built. She accepted some of the requests, not all. Each time a new task appeared, she opened her mother's journal, searching the faded notes for some method of organizing it, as though Rose Bennett still stood somewhere in that narrow kitchen, quietly reminding her that anything made by hand must never exceed the reach of those same hands. By early summer, climbing beans had swallowed an entire section of fence. The mint spread so aggressively she had to split it between 2 old clay pots. The apple tree behind the cabin gave a small yield, but the fruit held firm enough for several batches of pastries. On the front porch, 4 mismatched chairs lined the wall, a place for anyone who wanted to sit and drink tea. A tin container couldn't keep up with the loose change anymore. She replaced it with a wooden box that had a sliding lid. Her mother's journals stood in neat stacks on the kitchen shelf, each bound with ribbon cut from salvaged fabric. Her own notebook had nearly doubled in thickness since she'd started it. On an afternoon near the end of August, Margaret was setting jars of apple cinnamon preserve on the outdoor table when she heard an engine at the far end of the dirt track. Not a delivery van, not one of the local pickups. Smoother, more enclosed. She looked up. A dark sedan rounded the bend, rolled slowly forward, and stopped at the clearing's edge in front of the cabin. The driver's door opened. Daniel Hale stepped out. He stood motionless beside the car, eyes moving from the garden to the mended porch roof, from the table lined with goods to the cabin door standing half open, and finally to Margaret. She set the last jar on the table, smoothed the cloth beneath it, and only then let her spine go straight. Daniel shut the car door, took a few steps, stopped at the edge of the clearing like a man unsure whether the ground ahead still belonged to him. Dark overcoat, polished shoes, shirt collar pressed into a blade-sharp crease. Everything about him still curated, still precise. But his stride had lost its old certainty. The skin around his eyes had loosened, pulling downward, turning what once read as severity into something closer to fatigue. Quote 25. He said. She looked at him, did not nod, did not wave him closer. Just stood beside the wooden table with her fingertips resting on the edge of the cloth. __, quote _26 __. His eyes moved across the garden again. The bundles of dried herbs swaying beneath the porch overhang, the neat rows of glass jars catching light, the mint pots flanking the steps. He lingered on the porch railing she had repaired. The shed door cracked open, the hand-lettered sign near the entrance. The longer he looked, the slower his words came. Quote 27, he said quietly. Quote 28. The words landed soft, no edge, no volume. And precisely because of that, they hung in the air longer. He lifted one hand, brushed his cuff. The old reflex. Automatic as breathing. But this time, the gesture carried no authority. Quote 29, quote, he admitted. Quote 30, quote. Quote 31, quote. Wind swept through the yard. One corner of the wooden sign rocked gently on its nail. Daniel dropped his gaze to the dirt, then raised it. Quote 32, quote 33, quote 34. He corrected himself fast, as though hearing the implication a half-second after it left his mouth. Quote 35, quote. Quote 36, quote. Daniel inhaled slowly. His eyes drifted toward the car parked beyond the clearing. Quote 37, quote. Margaret didn't press for details. She walked to the far end of the table, slid the wooden coin box deeper into the shade, then came back to face him. Why did you come? Daniel went quiet. For the first time since stepping out of that car, he stopped scanning the property. He looked directly at her. To talk. We've talked. No. We discussed paperwork, court filings, arrangements. A pause. That wasn't talking. Margaret bent and picked a dry leaf the wind had dropped onto the tablecloth. When you stood outside that house and told me I could be placed in a facility, I thought you'd said everything there was to say. His jaw clenched, barely. Just enough. Things were completely different then. Different how? Daniel moved one step closer, then caught himself before his foot touched the porch stairs. The family house, he said, his gaze pulling sideways for a moment. It didn't last long. Costs ran higher than I'd planned. Taxes, repairs. Then the real estate agent didn't deliver on his promises. I had to sell. Margaret's expression didn't shift. She straightened the paper label on the nearest jar of preserves. The new apartment wasn't much better either. Everything changed fast. Did it? He watched her for a few more seconds, waiting for something larger than two flat syllables. Nothing came. He pressed on. I didn't drive out here to talk about money, but you're the one who steered us there. Daniel let out a slow breath. Fine, I'll say it plainly. I heard about you. Someone in town mentioned the old woman living out in the woods, who bakes bread, puts up preserves, sells herbs. They spoke about it like it was a place everyone ought to visit at least once. He looked around again, slower this time, more carefully. I didn't expect you to build all of this. I didn't build everything, only what mattered. That's still a lot, not by your old way of measuring things. I was wrong. I figured once everything was done, you'd move somewhere near the city. Maybe stay with family. Or The sentence died in his mouth. I couldn't picture this. That's the only true thing you've said since you stepped out of your car. Margaret, I didn't come here to fight. But you didn't come just to look at the garden either. I want to know if there's still a way to fix some of this. She lifted her chin and looked straight at him. Which part? I don't know. A real conversation, a different arrangement. Maybe we handled the whole thing too coldly. You handled it. I just stood on the other side of the table. You know what I mean. No, I don't understand you at all anymore. The wind shifted. It brought the smell of ripe apples from behind the cabin. Daniel pulled off his gloves and held them in one fist. His unease was showing now, that polished composure no longer hiding it. I thought I was handling everything the right way, he said. Assets, legal matters, obligations. I thought that was the proper thing to do. Proper for whom? He had no answer. Margaret moved along the table's edge, drifting closer to the porch steps but not descending into the yard. The gap between them shrank just enough that neither had to raise their voice. You took the house, she said. You took the bank account. You took the car. You took everything that could carry your name on a document. Daniel's head dipped. I know. Did you think that was the end of it? He looked up. His eyes were heavier now. At the time, maybe I did. Margaret reached out and touched the cabin's doorframe beside her. Her fingertips settled on an old scratch in the wood. But it wasn't. No, it wasn't. Margaret didn't look away. You took everything that belonged to the life I used to live. But this place was never yours. Nothing in it is. Daniel looked around once more, slower this time, as though he was seeing it, truly seeing it, not just with shock, but trying to understand. The repaired porch, plain in its design. The rows of plants behind it, not the kind of perfect beauty you'd find in a magazine. The chairs under the roof, none of them matching. Everything here was simple, functional, made for hands, not for eyes. And that was exactly why none of it felt temporary. Is this what your mother left you? He asked. Yes. I think I vaguely remember her mentioning a place somewhere. He looked at the ground. I didn't listen. Maybe I never listened to as many things as I thought I did either. I thought life was made of things you could put on paper. The house, the accounts, the contracts, everything neat, everything labeled. I figured if we split it all fairly, that would be the cleanest way through. You always liked things in order. But nothing was as clean as I told myself it was. You didn't drive out here to share your philosophy on life. No, he admitted. I came because I wanted to know if there was anything left from what we had. Anything still worth saving? She didn't answer right away. A leaf broke free from the branch overhead, spiraling down in slow motion, landing on the edge of the table between two jars of apple preserves. Margaret picked it up, set it gently into the clay pot beside them. Saving? She said. And where exactly do you think that lives? Maybe in the fact that we spent nearly a lifetime together, Daniel offered. Maybe in the fact that I didn't understand what was happening until it was already gone. It is already gone. I expected you'd say that. Not because I want to make this harder for you, Margaret said. Because it's the truth. People talk about you. At first, I didn't believe any of it. Then I thought they were exaggerating. But standing here now, he shook his head slowly. I understand why they talk about this place. Do you? They're not feeling sorry for you. Quote 109. They speak about it like you've built something that matters, a place where people want to stop. A place they carry with them long after they leave. Margaret didn't respond right away. The wind moved through the bundles of dried herbs hanging beneath the porch roof. They swayed against each other, whispering. Do you understand what that means? She asked. Daniel looked at her. I'm not sure I do. It means that for the first time in years, People come to me because of what I create, not because of the role I filled inside someone else's house. He took those words without flinching, without turning away. I never saw that. You never looked. Silence settled between them, but it was different now. Not the sharp silence from before. This one was heavy, unhurried, almost solid, as if it had taken on physical weight. Daniel turned toward the dirt road that wound out through the trees. Evening was folding itself down over the forest. I thought I walked away from that marriage with everything that mattered, he said, speaking more to himself than to her. Margaret gave a nod so small it almost wasn't there. But you were wrong. This time she said nothing more. Daniel lifted his head, met her eyes, and something in that look told her he finally understood that no more words were needed. Everything worth seeing was already visible. The soil had been turned fresh. The kitchen glowed with light. The journals were open again, filled with new writing. Life was moving forward. It had not waited for his permission. I see it now, he said. Margaret straightened, not to prove anything, not to perform strength, just the natural posture of someone who no longer needed to make herself smaller so another person could feel tall. You took what was easy to see, she said, but you left behind what was never yours to take. His eyes moved across the cabin, the garden, the table where she sold what her hands had made, then back to her face. And there was nothing left in those eyes now, no calculation, no quiet hope of turning back the clock, only recognition that had arrived too late. Yes, he said. Margaret placed her hand on the door behind her. You should go. He lingered there another breath, stretching the moment thin, knowing it wouldn't hold. Then a single nod. No argument, no plea for one more chance. He didn't step onto the porch. Take good care of yourself, Margaret. She looked at him, her face, still, calm as river stone. You too, Daniel. She stepped back inside, closed the door, slowly. The wood swallowed the yard. The car parked along the dirt road. The man standing alone in a place that was never his. The latch clicked shut. Margaret moved past the wooden table, past the row of glass jars, catching the last warmth. She crossed to the window that faced the garden behind the cabin. Outside, the trees held perfectly still in dying light. On the kitchen ledge, the notebook waited. Open to the page with the recipe for the next batch, apple and cinnamon preserves. She picked up her pen, drew out the chair, sat down, and finished the line she'd left incomplete. The pen traveled steady across the page, each word arriving slow and clear, the way everything here had been built, not rushed, not made for show, but strong enough to last. Outside, the final light sank past the treetops. The dirt road settled back into its silence. No engine noise, no echo. It kept no record of what had just happened. What remained was the cabin, the garden, and the life moving at its own rhythm, owing proof to no one. If you've walked alongside this story to its close, thank you for giving your time to a journey that carried no explosions, but ran deep enough to reshape a life from the inside. If you'd like to find more stories like this one, stories of loss, of rebuilding, of the small, quiet things that hold an entire existence together, leave a like, share it forward, or simply stay a while longer. And if anything lingers from this story, perhaps it's not what was taken away. It's what was never anyone else's to take.